Hi, this is Script to Stage for A Fine Balance. Every week leading up to the opening night of A Fine Balance at Q Theatre, we are sitting down with the makers behind the Auckland Theatre Company and Prayas Theatre season to chat about the world of the play and the creatives behind it. I am Shananda Chatterjee, Assistant Director of A Fine Balance. When we discussed the emergency early on in the process of making A Fine Balance, we found that history had been rewritten for the younger generations. Depending on your background, including your age, where your family was from in India, your political alignment, everyone had received a different version of what happened during Indira Gandhi's emergency. Now, to chat more about this today, we've got some of our Prayas Whānau around the table to share their experiences. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
What I might do is just go around the table and get you guys to introduce yourselves and give me a little bit of your background.
Hi, I'm Sneha. So I have been with Prayas for the last 4 years. And I grew up in India, moved to New Zealand about 12 years ago, spent 23 years of my life in India. Grew up in Pune, which is a city in the state of Maharashtra. So I did my high school, university, did a postgrad, worked in India for a year or so, and then moved to New Zealand as a student, did a few more qualifications. And here I am.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to give you the life of Alicia in a nutshell. Born and raised in Mumbai, India, which is very close to Pune, where Sneha's from. It's in a state called Maharashtra. I was 23 when I moved to New Zealand. I studied and worked in India before I came here, and have been here for about 7 years now with Prayas for 2.
Hi, my name is Malik, and I grew up in the United Arab Emirates. For 17 years of my life, I moved away and came of age going to university in Canada, and moved to New Zealand in early 2016 to do my master's degree. I am a newcomer and a freshman, I suppose, when it comes to Prayas.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You are a novice in the Prayas world. So thank you guys for being here today. Let's just start by telling the audience about how you first heard about the emergency. Did you understand it? What was the information that was given to you? How did you come about it?
So the state board that I studied in had about 2 paragraphs on the emergency, is what I remember from school. I actually Googled it and looked it up yesterday. And yes, it's still the same content that we had back in school, because it just came rushing back into my head when I read it. It's just been reformatted. But we spent about a year studying about the 1600s and the 1700s. And yes, it's important, but India's history after independence is covered off in paragraphs. It's decades. It's the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. You get 2 paragraphs per decade. There's so much that happens in a decade. But that's all you get as far as curriculum goes.
Yeah.
We weren't told much about it back in school. My parents didn't talk about it at all. So I didn't even think about the emergency as a part of the history of a significant part of India's history. Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Because I remember this as well, having done most of my secondary education in India, and I was in a different board. I was in the national board, which was CBSE. I again also remember studying a lot of history up to the independence from the British, and then not much after that. Do you guys have any thoughts about why that might be?
I guess we're still kind of recovering from the whole independence, kind of getting a constitution and implementing it. I think people just got caught up into kind of making it work, making it happen. Maybe because the politicians didn't want anyone to capture the reality of some of the happenings post that. I mean, we know with the emergency, Indira Gandhi had posed in a lot of restrictions with the press about, the speeches that the politicians gave. They couldn't publish those. She shut down, she was censoring a lot of information that was going to the public. And I wonder if informally that has always been the case post-independence, while we've been finding our feet with how to make things work. It's been messy, so might as well keep that under wraps.
Yeah. Now, Malik, you have been really quiet over there, and I know that your experience of the emergency is slightly different to maybe ours. So do you want to talk to us about what it is that happened, what the consequences of the emergency was for your family?
My parents grew up in Maharashtra as well, like other Prayas whānau present here. They went to university in Pune. And for their master's degrees, they went to university in different places, in Bombay and in Aurangabad for their bachelor's degrees, and they saw the emergency. They saw this experience of a lot of their friends at college being arrested for expressing their political opinions.
Wow.
Throughout the mid-70s. And I think that for them was this massively dispiriting, had this massively dispiriting effect on their ability to think for themselves, because to them, education and higher education in particular was this liberating force in their lives. They didn't necessarily have the most calm or peaceful domestic environments to come back to. They saw it as a forum for expressing themselves outside of their parents' strictly and very rigidly defined parameters of what was right and what was wrong and what shouldn't be discussed in the open. And going beyond, I mean, watching people be persecuted for what they believed was absolutely devastating, I think, for them. Right. It came as an immense relief, something that my parents didn't discuss with me until I was in my sort of late teens, and once I had gone through adolescence, they would not speak to me of the emergency growing up at all. I learned about the emergency for the most part from my friends' parents.
Wow, okay. And this is in where you grew up in
Abu Dhabi, in the capital of the United Arab Emirates. So I and also from uncles and aunts, and also from my grandparents, who were happier to speak about how the emergency affected them. But its direct impact on my parents was that they were immensely relieved when the country came to be run by individuals and political parties that they didn't see as oppressors.
Right.
And they were massively kind of, they had this sense of loss and this sense of grief when in 1980 the tables were turned again, and Indira Gandhi was swept back to power.
Right. Okay.
So they started their master's degrees knowing that they were going into a general election, which incidentally was the last time that my parents voted. Following which they made an active choice not to vote because they had lost all confidence entirely in our sense of democracy, which probably influenced their decision in the early 80s, once they finished their master's degrees, to move away from India for good and move away to a place where there wasn't the constant letting down of hopes and ambitions, which they found in the United Arab Emirates.
Cool. That's very interesting. So their kind of journey almost reflects what Manik is going through in the play A Fine Balance, because he's that university going, college going student, and he is Dina's informant of all the happenings in the in college, and he says that people are just being arrested left, right, and center, and there is a lot of censorship that's going on, etc. So that's really interesting. Yeah.
And also what happens with his friend Avinash.
That's in the book.
Yeah, that's in the book.
And Sneha, while we are with you, you mentioned that your father was is he an activist or an MP?
No, he was a local politician.
Oh, cool.
So
So,
growing
and
up,
with which party?
Congress I
So that is the same
as Indira Gandhi's party. Yeah.
Was he active during the time of the emergency?
No, he would have been way too young then. So he was a politician way after the whole thing, but he was part of the Congress I. And growing up, I was way too young when he was actively a politician. I do remember some conversations that used to happen in the household around Indira Gandhi, and then it was like maybe a mention of emergency here and there, but nothing in detail ever. And also, I guess because he came from the Congress I, where everyone was staunch supporters of Indira Gandhi, I guess no one ever wanted to speak about the emergency, considering the whole negative aspect that would kind of bring about. So again, for me, it's interesting that my school curriculum, the board that I studied under, didn't really have a lot about the emergency at all. So the first time I probably heard about it was when I saw the fine balance for the first time, when Prayas had it in 2015.
In 2015, yeah.
Yeah. So that was the first time when I was like, oh, there was something like an emergency that happened in the country. But for whatever reasons, I didn't really explore it as much then. But since being part of the fine balance again, I guess that's triggered me to kind of find out a bit more about, what happened. And reading the book definitely helped because that opened my eyes to a whole different world that I didn't know existed.
Was there anything which was like, oh my God, what was like the most interesting things in your research that you found?
I think the whole mass sterilization thing and forcing people to actually have it done, that really kind of yeah.
I actually found in my research that, and that was not the last time that India had forced mass
Really?
sterilization. In fact, 2013
Yeah.
What?
and something like 15. Yeah, there's been some mass sterilization. I don't know the entire background of why, but I've been finding more and more because I've been doing some research to put into the play, fill in with sound bites and things like that. And I've just been discovering so much information about other sterilizations and how it has affected more the rural women than men. And it's just fascinating. And I'm like,
Wow.
why did we not know about this? Why are we so oblivious?
No, which is what I find the most fascinating about this as well, because like Sneha said, she read the book, it opened her eyes to a world that she didn't have any idea about.
Yeah.
Where the book's set in India. Technically, we've all lived in India. We should probably have an idea of stuff like this happening.
Yeah.
We've been living in a bubble that has been so oblivious to all of this. It sort of opens your mind to the fact that India is just so different.
Yeah.
Someone 5 kilometers away from you could be living a completely different life.
Yeah.
And
And
you
those
wouldn't know.
bubbles, for instance, in the 2016, the United States elections, we've discovered that social bubbles can impact on politics and views of people, and people don't see outside their own sort of group. And we are not in a social media fueled bubble. It's just one that exists because there is so much. Otherwise, I guess it's almost like this unconscious bias that we have developed that helps us to navigate
The chaos.
the chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
In addition to navigating chaos, I also think it's a coping mechanism to deal with so much trauma, because being surrounded by and being completely enveloped by trauma is a daily occurrence for anyone who walks in the street in most urban or rural areas. There is a lot of extremely visible, extremely palpable injustice that is meted out to people, and you see it. And I sometimes wonder whether our parents and our grandparents don't make the active and conscious choice to simply block things from their memories, because you feel that there is a feeling of helplessness that comes from standing there, realizing that
ये
you're
तो ऐसा ही
human.
चलता रहेगा. This is going to keep going exactly
it-
the same way as it has been going for years.
It gets normalized after a while, and
Yeah.
you don't think about it.
Yeah.
You get
It was
desensitized,
fascinating
no?
because, when we've been doing these informal discussions with Prayas and some of our whānau called Adda, And in that, I think one of the first sessions that we had, we discovered how much trauma actually individually all of us faced. And we've just normalized it so easily. So I can imagine that these rural societies or otherwise, like the bubbles that they live in. So Alicia, tell me, when you first started researching about a fine balance and the emergency, did you speak to your peers? Did you speak to your parents? What kind of reactions did you get from the people that you were trying to get some information out of?
So when I started working on the production, the first thing I probably did was ask mom, dad, do a call out on Facebook for friends and family to let me know if they remembered anything from the emergency, what they remembered was covered off in the curriculum, because it wasn't quite fresh in my head. Similar responses. Not much was covered, more needs to be done. Asked dad and mom. Well, dad was about 14 or 15 years old when it happened. Mom was 9, so mom has zero memory of it. Plus our family, as a whole, I know, was living in a part of India that didn't quite get affected by the emergency as much.
Where were they living?
Which was in Mumbai.
Okay.
Yeah. Our families weren't very politically aligned. It probably just came and went and they didn't even know it. Dad, on the other hand, said, I don't remember much. Just came and went. I was in school. I was 15 years old. Don't know much. Family didn't talk about it. That was his stand about a couple of months ago. And then yesterday he tells me, your grandfather, like his dad, used to hate Indira Gandhi. And I was like, why did he hate Indira Gandhi? Don't ask me all that. I don't know. But he used to hate Indira Gandhi. He used to sit with a newspaper outside in the veranda every day and just look for news to see when she's going to lose the election or when she's going to get out of power.
Wow.
And he used to follow this guy or really support this guy called Raj Narayan. I'd never heard of him before. Googled him. Turns out he was the guy who won the case against her for the malpractice in the elections. Yeah, and after that, in the 1977 elections, he fought against her in her constituency in Raebareli. And he won against her. And apparently my grandpa was happy that day. He was so happy. And Dad remembers that. It's a visual that's come into his head now that I've been harping on about the emergency for a couple of months now. He didn't mention it.
It takes a while because people forget, like you said, I am just assuming that most of us grew up in a middle class environment, and I feel like we were probably the least affected in terms of good or bad, with maybe your exception, Malik, because your parents were active students at that time at a college level where things are like the intelligentsia is at its peak. I asked my parents also, and my dad was like, it was so good for the country because the trains were all running on time. All the bank managers had to get there on time. No Babu was, meant to be there at 9, was always at 9. He wasn't there at 10:30 eating his samosa. Like that is the typical bureaucratic things that you hear in India. It's like everybody's lazy, things like that. So that was my dad's point of view. He was like, the country was running like clockwork, and he was close to 20, so I guess he was also in that college environment, but he was in a like a government, not a government college, but a not a politically charged kind of environment. My mother, however, was at I forget the name of the college, but it is one where that has produced a lot of political and economic kind of figures. And she was like, I just stayed out of it. I went and came back. So she actively did not participate. What was did you have any interesting things that your parents came up or people around you when you started researching about it?
So my source of information was my grandfather.
Okay.
So I called him and I was like, so what happened during this time? So he worked for the Indian Railways. So he was a station master, as they call it then.
Did he love it?
He loved it. It was like all his life.
Trains ran on time. Like that was
and that's the first thing he said to me as well. It was amazing. The trains were running on time. All the government offices were like really working so well. Everyone was punctual.
Do you know why? Because like I realized it was such a big deal because when we were chatting with Amit uncle about the history of the emergency, he said that apparently there was some kind of rail strike for almost 2 years leading up to that point.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's all right.
And that's frustration.
Yeah.
Yeah. talking
The
after
middle
that.
class frustration.
Yeah,
The
I mean,
burgeoning pot-belly frustration.
They just want to get to work on time, you know?
Yeah, do their thing and come
Yeah,
back on
do their
time.
thing and come back.
Yeah. But the other thing he probably mentioned was that they were, because I asked him, so were they, all these activists on the street? Was there like some, violence, some demonstrations? Like, how was the environment? And he was like, no, there were some people creating a bit of nuisance, but I had all the local politicians from the Congress come up to me and tell me that, oh, you don't worry about anything. We'll make sure everything is running smoothly and you will be protected. So he was pretty satisfied about that.
Because apparently all the other political activists were incarcerated.
Yes.
As soon as the emergency was declared, all the opposition, all of them, were put in jail.
Yes.
Which was, again, another thing that I found out from our chat with Amit Uncle, was like, he said that because they were all incarcerated together, they then formed an alliance so that when they came back, that 77 election or whatever, they were able to topple her
Yes.
and take power.
So that Raj Narayan was part of that with Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Morarji Desai, and who went on to lead the country.
So, Maulik, when you finally spoke to your parents about the emergency, what was their reactions? Like, what was their story? What did they tell you?
They started off, they did not give me an unprompted story, so they had to be sort of nudged quite a lot. I was doing my capstone project for my first year at university, and I was looking at the evolution of how people came to vote and the social sphere in India throughout the 70s and the 80s, because it was the advent of, I was fascinated by the advent of television and how it changed people's lives. And I asked them about the emergency in the context of you were being communicated to through newspapers and radio primarily in the 70s. What was that experience like? And it needed a lot of prodding, but my mother said, well, she started off with the trains ran on time. Trains ran on time. Everyone,
this is going to be the catchphrase for this podcast. The trains ran on time.
The trains ran on time. She said that people were afraid people were afraid at government posts in particular of being late. They were afraid of asking for petty bribes. She remembers the experience of seeing some of her acquaintances, some of her friends, and it took sort of 10 minutes into that conversation where she got into the experience of seeing some of her friends rounded up and arrested.
They were activists?
They were certainly politically active on campus.
I see.
And she spoke to the experience of saying that after that point, it didn't seem like being a political person or having political thoughts at all was safe. So it was better just to stay away from politics and be apolitical, because clearly there are consequences that people in power have when it comes to expressing those in the context of someone who is ultimately the most powerful person in the country and decides that everyone and everything who doesn't agree with her is a threat to her personally, is treasonous, like some sort of monarch.
Yeah. I guess we, again, going back to that history, I learned so much from Amit Uncle at our podcast about the history of the emergency. And he was saying that there's the Indira Gandhi's 20-point program was majorly to do with disciplining the country and bringing some sort of order to it. And then Sanjay Gandhi took it to the next level of, like, I think, evilness, so to speak. And he introduced the 5-point program, which kind of we see a lot of in A Fine Balance in the play, where the sterilization and the beautification of the cities and other things come into play.
He wanted to abolish dowry as well as part of that program, if I'm not mistaken. That was
I mean, on face value, none of it looks awful. You know, like the 20-point program didn't look awful. I mean, like, who doesn't want the government to work as they should be? Who doesn't want to, you know, not stand in queue for hours at the bank just to get like one stamp? Because that's the plight of the people. Even now, like,
Yes.
try get an internet connection in the country, and you're like, wow, I will just live off rocks. You know, like,
Yeah.
so yeah, and it feels like that if you hadn't realized what kind of consequences it could have in that, like the political side of things, and then of course the rural consequences, you would never imagine that it was
No.
actually a bad thing.
No, face value, it looked okay.
Yeah.
You know, and I guess that's why a lot of the country was okay with it.
I think also in the cities, the way people experienced it was very different to what happened
Exactly.
in rural areas. Like, I remember asking my grandfather specifically about the sterilization, and I said, so how was it? He's like, oh, didn't really see much of it in the city. But then again, while I was doing my research, I think there was a figure of 8 million people were sterilized.
I think it was
Or-
6 million or something along those lines. A lot of people.
Yeah, a lot of people.
I mean-
so where did they find these people if it was not in the city?
It was in the rural areas.
Rural
It was in
areas.
the actual rural areas. Again, history of the emergency with Amit Uncle. You should really, like, I found so many fascinating things. Like, yeah, so that this maybe the beautification was more on the and actually that's something my dad said as well. Oh, the cities just looked so much cleaner. They did, because the slums were removed.
Of course.
Um,
People were
and-
removed too, so
Yeah, well, they just brought bulldozers, and like I remember this. Well, I remember this happening in the 90s in Delhi, so it's not like it's gone away. People, you know, it depends on what was happening, and I believe, like, India's not isolated. Like, we shouldn't give it that much flack, because I hear accounts of the 2011 Rugby World Cup and a lot of homeless people being forcefully removed from their places, their, you know, like covered places that they lived within, especially in the city. So that happens everywhere.
Yes.
And the great thing I find about Delhi anyway, where I grew up, every time you removed the slums, like a month later they were back.
yeah.
It
Oh,
was
yeah.
so great. The people are so resilient. And at that point, you know, like growing up middle class and obviously only knowing the values that your parents impart upon you, you think, oh, what an eyesore. And now, like, you're actually, especially removed from it, you know, I feel like, and you guys tell me how you feel, because I feel like if I was still in India, potentially I would not I wouldn't feel empathy for those people
No.
that were removed and kept coming back. Because at that point, I was just like, oh, eyesore.
Yep. And you get desensitized to it. You're not thinking from their point of view. You don't put yourself in their feet. It's easy for us to talk about all these things sitting here. Yeah, but we had,
I guess, like, growing up, you know, all of us grew up with, you know, the maids coming at home who potentially are people living in the slums.
Yeah.
And all we related to was whether she came on time, did the work properly, and went away.
And we were not unkind to them.
No, we weren't, but we didn't really have that sense of empathy that I guess is
Yeah.
coming through now.
Yeah.
Getting a better sense of what their experience would be like.
Yeah.
which we wouldn't need to have at that point, because if we were to put ourselves back into where we came from in India, we'd probably be living our lives a lot more differently.
Yeah. And it's the clockworkness of it all that
Yeah.
just kind of has to.
You just can't be bothered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Malik, do you have any thoughts on that?
I reckon I struggle with this every time I go visit. I struggle with the experience of knowing that, hey, this person who is doing something for me probably lives in a very, very different environment. And so normally I'm like, I made this for lunch today. Would you like some? And that's my extremely minuscule contribution to I suppose sleeping a little bit easier at night, as well as kind of going, I have put out in the world something that is important to me, which is to feel empathy for and express empathy for another human being who, through no fault of their own, has found themselves sort of in the circumstances that they
Yeah.
that they live with.
I tell you though, like, if you're living there, you know that the maids have their own union.
Yes.
They have more rights now than they used to have, and they have holidays. I mean, sometimes I feel like they have better holiday schemes than I do.
Oh,
right
our
now.
maid's sassy. She's
all of them
so
are.
sassy. She won't show up if she
They
doesn't
make
want
it hard to empathize with them.
Yeah.
I think
But
everyone
this is like an
lives-
entirely whole conversation in itself.
Yeah, I know,
Don't go into
and I guess it is one of those, and it's probably one of those bubbles because like everything has to work in a certain way so that, and the relationships then we have with the class relationships, you know, they work and the country works. Like that's how it works. That's the machinations, I guess,
Yeah.
of how a billion people, you know, coexist.
Exactly.
Sometimes very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, like, but I don't know what else goes on in their world, like and I probably also don't know what goes on in like Dhirubhai Ambani's world. So
No.
anybody care to take a stab at that?
I can take a pretty good guess. But,
By the way,
And that
Dhirubhai Ambani
conversation.
is one of the richest people in the country, if not the world.
the
Yeah,
world.
the
I
world,
think
I
it
would
is.
In the
I would
world,
say.
yeah.
He's not around anymore.
Oh,
but yeah,
isn't
his
he?
kids.
his
Beyonce
sons.
performed at his kid's wedding.
That's
His
Anila.
grandkids.
Grandkids' wedding.
Grandkids'
Right.
wedding.
Yeah. So that's how rich he
Mukesh and
is.
Anil Ambani. Yeah.
Mukesh Ambani, that's right. But
Yeah.
you know, like, and again, and that's probably why the information. And you think about how we're talking about the late 70s. There was no internet.
No.
So how were we to find? I mean, like, even if you think about now, social media becoming that, you know, bubble. Like, how was the information even traveling? And that's probably why people didn't realize about the sterilization problem that was in the rural India, because like,
Yeah. and-
especially in the cities, growing up middle class, like no one knew.
But then all the information that was being published was censored anyways.
That's right.
So were they actually being truthful about what was going on? Probably not. So there was no actual. If newspapers were the only
Fake
ways.
news.
Yeah, it actually reminded me of fake news.
We did it first.
Because the time when the emergency was declared and she rounded up all these opposition leaders before they were incarcerated, that was the very time when she cut the power off for the area of the city which had all the newspaper agencies.
That's right. It was a blackout, and they couldn't
Yeah.
print, and then they had to redact like whole bits of the.
That's right.
Yeah.
So they had two preferred news agencies who were allowed to publish information. I think Doordarshan and the radio in All India Radio, they were instructed to send all the news to the Prime Minister's house so it could be kind of checked
Cleared.
and
Edited.
cleared
for publication.
before it could actually be relayed. So in an environment like that, there's no way they're going to get the real information of what they're up to out.
It's just crazy fascism. Like, it's just, it's so hard to imagine. So, guys, before you learned about the emergency and its implications, and especially before you started doing all your research for a fine balance, did you have any impressions of Indira Gandhi and what she meant to India? Alicia, did you want to start?
Sure. I think growing up, we had pictures of Indira Gandhi in school in the staff room. She was the first female prime minister of our country. She was called the Iron Lady of India. As a little girl, I aspired to be like her. I looked up to her. And fancy dress competitions at school, and kids dressing up as Mother Teresa and Indira Gandhi, and they used to walk in side by side. So, I mean, I grew up with a picture painted for me of someone that I should be like when I grow up. Which I don't think that way anymore, but...
Yeah, interesting. Sneha?
Well, I grew up idolizing her as well because, again, coming from a family who was
In Congress.
in
Yeah.
Congress, Indira Gandhi was the leader.
Yeah.
So she was always a very strong feminist sort of a role model.
Icon, yeah.
Yeah, growing up, and you wanted to almost kind of be her when you listened to, everything
Yeah.
that people had
India's
to say.
daughter.
Yeah, India's daughter.
Yeah, that's what she was.
Yeah.
And with so many strong male figures all around us, I guess she was that one female character that was running a country
Yeah.
that made us really look up to her.
And the power she had over people is amazing. she could just draw crowds.
And she was charming, right? When you look at pictures, when you look at, the way she
Yeah.
carried herself,
Yeah.
you can easily see how someone would want to be like her. Someone
Yeah.
who doesn't know
Yeah.
much,
Yeah.
face value,
Yeah.
you know?
Malik, did you have any different opinions of?
I suppose the way that I related most to Indira Gandhi was the fact that my mother and Indira Gandhi both shared the trait of having consciously short hair throughout all of my childhood,
Right.
which was a massive statement in a world where women were
Yep.
supposed to grow out their hair, and it was this
Especially in Indian culture,
in-
where
in Indian
long
culture.
hair is equated to beautiful. And
Yes. So I guess that was how, I mean, the values that my parents held dear around the house were being calm as much as possible, being measured, being pragmatic, being cautious in what you said before you said it, and being very careful. And that I saw reflected in many of the things that Indira Gandhi either said or what she would appear like in television interviews. Now, this, of course, is in the late 90s, where all of it would have been archive footage, and she was long since assassinated on Halloween in 1984.
Yeah.
And
that's right. Sorry, it just struck me that it was Halloween.
yes, on the morning of, yeah. So I suppose it's an image you hold growing up just because it has no because it comes from archival footage. It has no relationship to a historical character, and because my parents wouldn't talk about her,
You had no other way of
I
knowing.
had no other way of knowing.
Yeah.
No.
It's interesting because, and that's what it is, isn't it? Like and the same for me. I also grew up thinking of her as this amazing feminist icon. And she was all of that.
Yeah.
I think we do a disservice to people, especially people in power, when we think that they can only be one way, and that absolute power corrupts. And I think that's the cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason.
Yes.
And no matter the Daenerys effect, she was well-meaning in her, apparently the case that started this whole thing was quite like, there was random things that they accused her of, and very like they got her on some really tiny technicalities, and that made her go, okay, that's it, you guys don't deserve me, and you don't deserve democracy, so we'll take all your rights away. And then she started by wanting to be like a disciplinarian, okay, that strict school teacher.
Yeah.
But then just this whole thing just cracked, and it descended into totalitarianism, which is really interesting. And I guess for me, it's just history is super subjective. This is so close, and this is one of those things that is, documented primarily by word of mouth.
Yeah.
And amazing things like a fine balance, without which we wouldn't even be having this discussion around this table. Like,
totally.
it has definitely been the reason I looked into the emergency more, and got interested in the politics of the time. And subjective history. Do your research, people. Don't ever take anything you see, read, hear on face value.
Never.
Like, it's the one thing to take away from all of this. There's multiple sides, especially in a country as complex, as a society as intricate as India, of 1 billion plus people. Like, lives are just so different, and we live in so many different bubbles, and all those bubbles have different, like, Venn diagrams of how caste, class, religion, all of those things, money intersect,
So much privilege, so much power, so many power dynamics that we just take for granted.
Exactly.
Exactly. And people doing so many things through the course of their lifetime. And us we're literally pulling a magnifying glass on the 20 months.
Yeah.
of the emergency
Yeah.
and how people reacted to it at that time. There's so much more to it than that. And
Yeah.
I mean, looking at this research, I'm still looking stuff up as we go. I still haven't formed an opinion about Indira Gandhi yet.
Yeah, I feel like whatever values I had imbued her with have definitely been shaken, but not quite changed
Yeah.
fully.
It may interest all of our listeners to learn that Indira Gandhi is the Prime Minister in certainly post-independence history who gave maximum funding to the arts and to theatre in particular.
Damn,
Wow.
I do love her a little bit more. It's so complicated. I'm so confused. I don't know how I feel about her anymore, guys. But hey, thanks for coming along today. I thought that was super, super interesting. Just because it's always useful to learn how our peers are feeling in that same space. Like, again, to burst our own bubbles, I think it's really important to keep having these discussions. And let's continue this discussion outside of this podcast and, you know, make sure we are always, you know, talking about the politics of the country that we grew up in. And it was great. And like I said, we wouldn't even have this discussion had we not been all involved in A Fine Balance, had the book not existed, had the play not been put up by our two amazing production houses. So yay. The next episode will be our last in A Fine Balance series, where we will chat to Amit Odedar again, who's the press founder and historical cultural advisor for A Fine Balance. And we will be chatting also to Lynn Cardy, who's the associate director of Auckland Theatre Company, about this amazing collaboration. So thank you again, folks, for coming today. And thanks to all the listeners for listening. Cheers, guys.
Come watch the show.
Plug. Thanks, guys.